Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be talking about the books that I've been reading this week. So let's get on with it. And I mean, just sort of by wonderful coincidence, a lot of the books sort of overlap quite a lot in themes, and it's quite nice when that happens. It's never really actually intentional. It sort of just happens. I sort of will start reading something and be like, oh, well, this is kind of an interesting, fun thing. But anyway, let's get started on those. And yeah, and I hope you're also having a good week. First up, as part of the sort of Eurovision reading challenge I set myself, I read Queer Ukraine, which is an anthology of LGBTQI plus Ukrainian voices during wartime. And so this was just a very short kind of little kind of compilation of some essays, some poems, some sort of more sort of fictional pieces. But you know, it talks a lot about the kind of the experience of being LGBTQ plus in Ukraine, and how parts of that have been complicated by wartime. So, for example, in this there are various essays about how in the land that is now Ukraine, there have always been some kind. There's always been some kind of history of LGBT people existing. There is an essay that talks about how sort of LGBTQ plus rights are kind of made really complicated by sort of after the Russian invasion, because it sort of has meant that for a lot of people there, they're not only sort of fighting Russia, but also kind of fighting the kind of potential of the sort of homophobic laws that could come with it. And so I just thought this was a really interesting little collection, some really beautiful, heartfelt parts, some really angry parts in this as well, which is obviously incredibly justified. And so just a really interesting little collection if you can sort of get your hands on it. Next up, I read Carla by Colin Walsh, and this is a book that I read about half of, or a bit of, when I was doing my review last week, and was saying then that I really loved it. That very much carried through. I adored this book. I thought it was an incredibly clever and powerful book. So it talks about a missing girl, sort of nicknamed Carla, and she is this sort of mysterious figure throughout the book. So many people remember her, and you know, a large amount of the book is sort of, well, the modern day in the book is sort of roughly our modern day, and Carla went missing sort of a good sort of 15-20 years before. And so she's this sort of unspoken secret in the town. Everyone remembers something about Carla. Nobody's really come together and pieced together their parts of the story. So somebody will remember that the night she went missing, a certain thing had happened, or somebody will remember that she was always a certain kind of way. And nobody's really pieced it together. And this sort of secret has really lingered over this town, and it's quite a touristy town. So there's this sort of thing of, well, things like that don't happen here. This is a very quiet, leafy little town, and you know, things are really lovely here. And so a lot of it gets kind of overlooked. And so as a result, when they start really digging into the history and the everything that potentially happened here, it gets incredibly convoluted, where we suddenly realize there are these motives that have been laying hidden for a long time for why people have either hidden the truth, or why people may have been involved in her disappearance in the first place. So it's a really gutsy and gut-wrenching book in many, many ways. Carla is this sort of mysterious figure who never speaks in the book. She's only ever spoken about. And I saw an interview with Colin Walsh where he was speaking about this. And I thought it was really interesting, because he said that there was somebody, I'm sort of paraphrasing his story here, but Colin Walsh was talking about how there was somebody who was writing or trying to write an autobiography of Frank Sinatra, and kept on trying to interview Frank Sinatra. And his people kept on saying, no, like, you know, he's busy right now, he's got a cold, come back another time. And eventually he pieced together a biography by talking to everybody who had known him in some way. So the person who valeted his car, the person who waited out, you know, who looked after this part of his life or whatever, and built up a story that way. And Colin Walsh was saying he was sort of inspired by hearing about this biographer in the way that he approached Carla. And I think it really shows. Carla is almost more mysterious because we never hear from her. Because everybody is only ever acting on their story of her, and this is so many years down the line that it's sort of they're piecing together something from memory and from stories that they've heard and kind of absorbed and pretend, you know, they almost feel like it's a memory now because they've heard it so many times, even though it didn't actually, hello Cindy, even though it didn't actually happen, or it didn't happen that they saw. So where are you going, Cindy? So yeah, it's just a really interesting book, I think, for that. The writing is really powerful and punchy. It reads like a thriller at times. It has these quiet, reflective passages. I think it's a brilliant, brilliant book. And yeah, I am excited for more people to read it. So next up, 3 books that are really connected in many ways, particularly around sort of themes around motherhood and kind of reproductive rights. And yeah, in very, very different ways in these 3 books. But anyway, let's start with this one here, Take My Hand by Dolen, Perkins-Valdez. This is a book that sort of mirrors real life things that happened in the US and elsewhere, but particularly focuses on the US, where many people had their reproductive rights stripped away in some form, or had other horrific things happen to them in the name of science. So this book takes as its inspiration the real life cases of both a group of men being forcibly, well, I say forcibly, kind of, it wasn't necessarily by force, but they definitely weren't actively consenting to all of this, were injected with syphilis and other infections to basically have them as live test cases for like to see how the disease progressed, to see what effects there were, to see how medication could be used to treat it. But this was specifically the Muskogee trials. This was were largely focused on black men. Basically, it was sort of poor men of color specifically who were targeted. And this book then sort of leaps to the next thing, which is something that also happened in around a similar time, which is people from poorer neighborhoods, typically Black and Latino people, were basically given some form of what they were told was just sort of normal birth control, but actually was sterilizing them. And it did quite a lot to basically, yeah, just it was part of an active attempt at stopping these people from ever having kids, in a really pernicious way. You know, people were not given the chance to consent. They were not given proper information. They were told completely wild stories about what it was instead. Really dark, tricky things. And Take My Hand basically tells the story of that from the perspective of a sexual health nurse who's working with a couple of young girls and sort of realizes what's been going on and tries to escalate it to the sort of the higher courts in the land. It's a difficult read in many ways for a lot of those things. I think the book does a fairly good job, I think, of making it light where it can be, and inverted commas, because it's not really light in any way, but as in it finds moments to make this a bit of an easier read, or to make it to be able to kind of go over some of these things in a bit more detail without it kind of completely subsuming the reader. So I think it's a really powerful story. I will say, I think at times I feel like it was a little bit overlong. I feel like actually maybe it could have made the point a little bit sooner. But I also get that part of that is kind of creating the window dressing to kind of really get you into the story, to really be able to tell you the more factual things without it just feeling like a Wikipedia article. But yeah, a really punchy read about a very, very difficult topic. So yeah, if you feel like this, wouldn't completely drag you under to read it, then maybe give that a go. But yeah, just a really shocking set of historical events that it's really shameful ever happened in the first place. Next, I read Cousins by Aurora Venturini, and translated by, when I can find this, I will just pop it in the notes. Translated by Kit Maud. And this is So she's an author who I think I'd heard of briefly, but I'd never read anything by. And she seems like an incredibly interesting author, from Argentina, and is this is sort of, it seems to be, you know, a book that's sort of widely held up as one of her sort of best, or kind of one of her best known. And so this book is quite an odd one, but kind of continuing on with the theme of reproductive rights. It focuses largely on a group of women, and they live in kind of quite odd circumstances, because quite a few weird and wonderful things happen in their lives. But particularly a large part is around reproduction, and around things around abortion, and various other things. And our sort of main character, Una, is this sort of outsider figure who sort of just watches the world go by. She has an almost simplistic way of viewing the world, and in a really interesting way, because it sort of means that the narrative occasionally, you know, we as the reader know what's going on. We know that something big is happening, but she's, you know, Una's just sort of like, oh, and this thing happened. I wonder if this thing will happen. I wonder if it will rain today. You know, sort of slightly distracted, slightly not quite grasping the importance of it. But in some ways that adds to the real power of this book, because there's a real, there's always something bubbling under the surface, and there's always something going on, sometimes quite darkly funny because of that, because the character doesn't really get it, or is sort of missing the point slightly, but also just overall a really interesting read. Again, quite deals with some quite grim things. I think, you know, any book, I guess, that deals with sort of abortion and reproductive rights is not going to be like a bar of laughs, but is, you know, there are some quite darkly funny and interesting moments in this, and it's written in this very odd, sort of slightly detached style that I think is really quite captivating in parts. So yeah, I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. And it's a surprisingly short book. It kind of is over really before it begins, but there's so much that goes on in the meantime. And last but not least, I read Berta Dávila's The Dear Ones, translated by Jacob Rogers and by 3x Rebel Press, who I really like. And so this is, again, a very short book. And this deals with motherhood in a sort of slightly different sense, of a woman who many years down the line, after having given birth, is thinking about whether or not to have an abortion, and as part of that, really going into some in-depth discussions with herself. But I think the thing that I really appreciate about this, and really about 3x Rebel Press themselves, is the way that this is a book about a complex issue, but it doesn't shy away from it. Sometimes I find that, you know, a book will throw in a complex issue, and the complex issue is the plot point, is the thing that moves the plot along. You know, it's something where it's kind of being chucked in either for shock value or to add some substance. And I think what I've been really enjoying about this book, and about 3x Rebel Press in general, is they have books about quite complex issues and let the complexity sit in the book. And so I think the thing with this is, you know, there are some in-depth conversations and discussions about what this woman wants to do next, but it's all told through a main character who has this really strong voice and sense of purpose, and there we go, Cindy, hello again. This really strong focus of how she's going to talk about this. So she's not a sort of a character who we're meant to sit there kind of listening, you know, she's not sort of sat there saying like, oh, woe is me, this thing's happening. This character has a really strong sense of purpose and a drive of how she's made her decisions and what she's thinking and where she's going next. And I really appreciated that about this book, that it has this real ability to let these complex issues sit and kind of stew, but equally the main character kind of is getting on with life. It's the book doesn't just get subsumed by it, she kind of does other things, she does ordinary things, and there's a very strong voice and focus of where she's going, and that's one of my favorite things in a book, I think, where characters just have a distinctive voice and the whole book is told with that sort of vernacular. And yeah, so I really enjoyed this book. And now those have been the books I've read this week. Surprising overlap with some of them there, just that how they ended up landing. But really exciting set of books, and yeah, I really enjoyed reading this week. I'm sort of slowly getting back into things. My brain has still been a little bit fried, so not reading quite as much as I'd like to be, but getting there. And it's about to be booker season, so I probably need to find that part of my brain again. Probably just get some sleep, really. Anyway, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.